Good morning and welcome. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. My name is Donna McInerney, and I'm the CEO of the Foundation for Educational Administration, which is the professional learning division of NJPSA. As many of you know, NJPSA and FEA work closely together to provide a continuum of services and supports for our members. And this work begins with our Government Relations Department, led by its director, Deb Bradley, who together with Jenny Lamont provides consistent and ongoing advocacy for our members and for what is best for New Jersey students. This range of supports continues through our extensive array of committees at NJPSA, including the Special Education Committee facilitated by Peg McDonald and John Worthington. All of our committees, and if you're a member, I encourage you to get involved in these committees. All of these committees provide a powerful forum for the voices of our members. Finally, professional learning provided by FEA, including leadership, legal education, best practices, and the legal education provided by our Legal One department led by Dave Nash, represents the third area of these supports on this continuum. These professional learning opportunities include webinars, roundtables, workshops, podcasts, coaching, asynchronous online learning on our Canvas platform, and numerous series and academies. So together, PSA, NJPSA, and FEA really focus strongly on this work of advocacy, collaboration, and professional learning to do what's best for our members and New Jersey's 1.4 million students. Today, we've assembled colleagues from each of these departments, as well as from the field, to discuss the legislation signed by Governor Murphy on June 16th with strong bipartisan support from the legislature. In addition, the governor committed $600 million of federal American Rescue funds to support districts in implementing the legislation, which applies to students with disabilities who turn 21 beginning with the 2020-21 school year and continuing through the end of the 2022-23 year. We know that students with disabilities were more significantly impacted during the pandemic than other students. We also know that students with more significant disabilities who were in the final years of their special education entitlement were particularly impacted by the closure of community-based work sites, businesses and transportation services, and the difficulty of virtual learning limiting access to their learning opportunities, which are so critical for transition to adult life. Today, our panel will provide a background on the new law, related guidance from the department, as well as strategies from the parent and district perspectives for implementing this new legislation in a way that is student-focused. A discussion with participants will follow with an opportunity for Q&A and suggestions for future topics and future sessions. Just so you know, within 24 hours, likely on Monday, you receive an email with a recording and a link to the Google resource folder that our panel put together. And before I turn it over to my colleague, John Worthington, Education Law Specialist with our Legal One department, I want to put out a special thank you to our NJPSA FEA team who brought this together, as well as a couple of our colleagues from the field, Patricia Dramones, Supervisor of Special Education Services at Ridgefield, and her colleague, Leslie Denson, High School Special Ed Supervisor. I also want to thank Peg Kinsel, Director of Public Policy with SPAN Parent Advocacy Network, for joining us, and for all of the panelists sharing their wisdom and expertise today. So without further ado, John, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Donna, and good morning, everyone. Next slide, Rob. Donna went over the agenda, so next slide. One more, okay. Yeah, before I get into, I'm going to do a quick overview of the law before we get into the rest of the program. I do have to give you my Legal One disclaimer. Yes, I'm an attorney, but I'm providing a summary of the law only. I cannot provide legal advice to anyone. There will be an opportunity for questions, and we're happy to answer all of your questions, but just keep in mind we will not be providing legal advice. We'll treat any scenario you give as hypothetical and provide answers accordingly. Next slide. One more, I'm sorry. Okay, so as Donna noted, on June 16th, the governor signed into law. It was S3434 was the bill. It's Public Law 2021, Chapter 109. And essentially what this law does is for the students turning 21 this year and in the next 2 years, it allows parents and IEP teams to determine on an individual basis whether additional or compensatory special ed and related services should be provided to students with disabilities who would otherwise be either graduating or aging out and their eligibility for special education and related services ending. And so keep in mind, it's important. It is an IEP team and parent decision. The parent is a part of the IEP team, so they'll be doing this together. And it's two different things. They can either provide additional services or compensatory. So it is not limited just to a determination of whether a FAPE or a free appropriate public education was denied to a student with a disability and thus compensatory services need to be provided. They can also make a determination to provide additional services to the student. And so this law, the scope of the law in each year will be 1 year of additional services. So for the first year, there will be no services beyond June 30th, 2022 provided in accordance with this law to a student with disabilities. However, keep in mind, they still have all their procedural protections. So the IEP team could determine to provide additional compensatory services beyond this 1 year. An ALJ in a due process hearing could issue such an order, could be ordered in a complaint investigation, or of course by a court of competent jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And so, as I noted, just keep in mind, it's a 3-year time period the law covers. So students turning 21 next school year, at the conclusion of next school year, a determination could be made the same way, whether to provide additional or compensatory services. And then at the conclusion of the following school year, the same determinations will be made. So over a 3-year time period, each year, those students who have turned 21 during that school year will be eligible for additional or compensatory services as decided by the parent and the IEP team. Next slide. So also, in addition, keep in mind now all rights, privileges provided under IDEA, New Jersey laws and regulations, the legislation specifically notes all of those rights are afforded to the students. So notice, meetings, all the different types of rights that you get under IDEA and the state's implementing regulations are accorded to the students who are receiving services pursuant to this law. The most important rights that are going to be provided to them would be with the procedural protections, mediation, complaint investigations, special education due process hearings, because when you're looking at this law, implementing it, if there's a dispute over whether a student should receive additional or compensatory services or the nature of those additional or compensatory services, they still can be resolved in mediation due process hearing. So any disputes, that's how they'll be resolved going forward. As far as the special ed related services and the like, how they're going to be funded, paid for. I think this is a significant piece of the law. This is a funded mandate from the legislature. And so the 3 stimulus packages, the CARS money, the ARP money, the CRRSA money, all of those funds, in addition to any other federal stimulus money that might be enacted going forward, all of that money is to be utilized to fund the costs of special education and related services and the like that are provided in accordance with the law. So that is a very important distinction in the law. It will be a mandate, but it is a funded mandate. So, do keep that in mind. Next slide, please. And the legislature also specifically provides, to the extent the federal funding is not sufficient to fund the costs under this law, they will use money from the property tax relief fund to do so. So if the stimulus money is not sufficient, we will have property tax relief money to do that. One of the areas where Peg and Deb will discuss is the timing of the funding. Will it be reimbursement? Will it be upfront payments? That's yet to be determined. They'll talk a little bit about that. But as far as what you can utilize the funding for, it could be additional staff. It could be for the programs, the transition, related services, whatever might be provided, facilities, And it also notes that as deemed necessary by the school district to provide special education related services and transition services pursuant to the law. So it's all costs attendant to that can be utilized. I want to stress here, I'll probably stress it again, make sure you're documenting the costs. If you have additional staff, programs, facilities, whatever you're utilizing that cost about a district placement, make sure everything's being documented to the extent that you're providing services, whether it's additional or compensatory. You can receive the reimbursement or upfront cost, however that plays out, but make sure you can document those costs so that you can seek the funding from the state. Next slide, please. Now, a couple of interesting provisions with regard to approved private schools for students with disabilities in the law, the age range and group size requirements for the 3 years of this law. So this year and the next 2 school years, those requirements are being waived by the legislation. So approved private schools will be able to exceed the typical 4-year age range for grouping students together. This group size requirements, there's a variety of them for resource, for special class programs and the like, some related services. They set group sizes. They've been waived for the approved private schools for students with disabilities when they're serving, for students receiving services pursuant to this law. So in other words, in order to serve these students, keep in mind approved private schools have a limited number of students that they're allowed to serve. These provisions basically will waive that, allow larger group sizes, age ranges, and an additional number of students can be attending those schools if they're receiving services pursuant to the law. Some requirements with regard to tuition rates were also adjusted by the law. So they set the total number of students and the maximum tentative tuition rate, because for an approved private school, they always get a tentative tuition rate. Then at the end of the year, it's resolved through an accounting procedure, and they either receive additional money if the tuition rate goes up, or they reimburse districts money if it goes down. So that's been adjusted slightly to account for the possibility of additional students attending the schools in accordance with this law. Next slide. So some questions raised by the legislation, and again, keep in mind, it's a parent and IEP team decision. They determine whether to provide additional or compensatory services, but the legislation will raise a couple of questions. I mean, the first thing you have to, not question, but an issue for this school year, the law was signed June 16th. That means you have very little time. Districts need to have IEP meetings quickly for all their students who turn 21 and would have otherwise aged out in this school year. You're going to have to quickly have IEP meetings for those students with the parent, make a determination, is the student going to receive additional or compensatory services? What's the nature of the services? Where will the placement be? Where will the services be provided? Because you have to leave yourself time to actually arrange for the special ed related services transition, whatever it might be. You have to have time to actually arrange for those services. So you're going to have to move quickly. In the next 2 school years, you're going to have more time. It should become part of your planning process. Remember, each year for your students graduating or aging out, you do a summary of performance in accordance with federal and state law. Making this part of that process would be a good way to proceed so that you can provide the summary, do the planning, make a determination of whether the students will receive additional or compensatory services in the following year, and you can do that planning a little more quickly. And remember, parents are going to need to be provided written notice of all IEP team decisions, whether it's to serve, not to serve. If you determine to provide additional or compensatory services, notice of exactly what those services will be. Next slide. And with regard to the nature of the services, do keep in mind the legislation does not say a repeat of the final year when you turned age 21. It doesn't say implement the same exact IEP. What it calls for is a determination by the IEP team with the parent who's a member of that team, making a determination of what additional or compensatory services to provide. So it could be the same exact program or placement. It could be different services. You might provide half days instead of full days. It might be that the student needs certain services for a set period of time. Nothing in the law says it has to last through next school year. It says the services end by June 30th of 2022, and then each subsequent June 30th. And so these are individualized determinations by the IEP team as far as what's going to be provided, how it's going to be provided. So all of that will have to be determined. They're all IEP team decisions, and you will have to make those determinations, provide written notice to the parents so that they understand exactly what services will be provided. Next slide, please. Now, keep in mind, too, this is an important provision. Providing additional or compensatory services under this law doesn't mean that a student or parent can't still seek additional compensatory services beyond what's provided in accordance with this law. So certainly potential liability for compensatory services to the extent you serve in this next year will be reduced based on providing those services, but it will not necessarily be eliminated. The law makes it very clear you still have all your procedural protections, so the ability to seek compensatory services would still be there, but it certainly will lessen the likelihood that somebody will be seeking that. And I think it's important for district IEP teams to remember to delineate, are you providing additional services or are you providing compensatory services? Because that'll be an important distinction to make. Compensatory services essentially means you did not provide a FAPE to a student and you're providing services to make up for the lack of a provision of FAPE. Additional is it's basically what it says. It's additional services, no such determination that a FAPE was denied. And so that could impact any future disputes over compensatory services, how you delineate those services in your determinations. And next slide, please. And just a quick note now, disputes over eligibility for services, frequency, amount, location, duration, all those disputes are going to be open for mediation, due process, hearings. Do keep in mind emergent relief will be available because with this year's school year, the next one begins July 1st, there's probably going to be a lot of requests for emergent relief if there's a denial of services or a dispute over the type of services. And because of the time that it typically takes for a due process hearing, those emergent relief decisions will probably control what services the student's going to get in the next school year, because by the time you adjudicate the underlying case, a long period of time will have run. So the key will be these emergent relief decisions. So do keep that in mind. Yeah, and again, the state funding, which they'll be discussing in a second, keep in mind, again, I want to stress documenting the cost. Yes, it contemplates the state funding the cost using stimulus money, state funding to the extent that's necessary. You have to document the costs in order to receive those that reimbursement. And one final point before we move on to the next segment, just keep in mind you want to coordinate the adult services. You want to, with DDD, Division of Voc Rehab, make sure you're coordinating with the adult services. They're typically payer of last resort. They're not going to duplicate services provided by the district, so consulting them, inviting them to IEP team meetings when you're making these decisions would be very helpful to coordinate what you're providing and what they're going to be providing as part of the adult services that they'll be receiving, to try to make sure the services are provided smoothly, there's no disruption in any services. Do try to work with those adult agencies as you go forward. And with that, we will move on to the next section.
John, we had one quick question. Is transportation costs covered?
It seems to contemplate any costs attendant to providing the services. So I would say yes, transportation. It talks about administrative, a lot of different costs. So transportation should be included within the costs, as well as the transition, special ed related services and the like that you would be providing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Debbie Bradley, Director of Government Relations at PSA, and Peg Kinsel will be joining me, the Director of Public Policy at SPAN. My role at the organization is to work with members like you to represent your interests before lawmakers, decision makers, and policymakers that affect the work you do. It's important work at PSA. And I'm happy to do it, proud to do it, mostly because we represent the best people. You're the folks who actually make it all work in the real world of our schools. And to all the special ed directors and staff in the audience, you have our thanks and respect. You have some of the toughest jobs in the district. You have to balance the needs of diverse stakeholders on both a systemic basis and on an individual student basis. And we know this is tough work. We knew from the outset when Senate Bill 3434 was introduced that this bill was ultimately going to be within your scope of responsibility. So we were actively involved from the outset, presenting this bill to our committee structure. At PSA, what we do when we look at legislation is we try to bring it to our committees. Our special ed committee in particular worked very strongly on this legislation, as well as our legislative committee. So what I'd like to do before I get into the committee work is talk a little bit about the legislative context of what went on during the pandemic. We hope that this will give you a little bit of context as you work to actually implement the bill. What happened once schools began closing down last fall was the legislature actually continued to work. Their initial focus really reflected what was going on in your schools. They initially focused in on things like health and safety, making sure schools had the PPE equipment and all of the rules that you needed to work in schools to make sure that students and staff were safe if they were in buildings. We then shifted into things like making sure schools had the tools they needed for students to learn remotely, like the issues dealing with the digital divide in schools. And then the legislature switched over to issues on lost opportunity. And the first bill that actually became law in this area dealt with the bridge year. And I know some of you have dealt with that in your schools. And before I turn this over to Peg on the bridge year, the legislation was passed into law and some of you have implemented it, but that opened the door for the legislature to start talking about learning loss for all kids. And we've been grappling with bills related to learning loss in a whole scope of areas. For example, yesterday the legislature finally passed a retention bill policy that's now moving to the governor's desk. We've dealt with bills dealing with assessment data gathering, mandatory summer school for all students, and plenty of bills that dealt with concerns about equity and the needs of special populations. So with that kind of context in mind, let me turn this over to Peg to talk a little bit about how her organization got involved in this legislation. You're on mute, Peg.
One more time. So good morning, everyone. So as Deb said, we at SPAN were doing a lot of the same things around advocacy as soon as the COVID restrictions for school kind of fell into place, and what the impact on health and safety for our families was, and then the additional issues of, technology, access to services, the adequacy of virtual services, those type things. But as we're all, and we were part of committees and task force, Deb and I spent a lot of time together this past year to, deal with learning loss. How do we successfully reintegrate students into school? And how do we, quite frankly, support your mission? Because if you're not successful, we're not successful. So unfortunately, though, even though we had, met with Department of Ed, started to talk to them about our concerns with a focus on the students that were transitioning to adult life. In the midst of that is when the Bridge Year bill was introduced, and the first iteration didn't even mention students with disabilities. So as you can imagine, a lot of my work is focused on equity and access. So that was a problem to begin with. Let's say fixes, and I'm going to use that term a little broadly because we didn't necessarily think they were fixes, opened up, though, the conversation around parent advocacy for students with disabilities. How come we don't get a bridge year? Why isn't there some way that students with disabilities are part of this cohort? And then the additional requirements under the cohort of, secondary education, certainly deadline, and those issues were all not impactful for our families. So that started the kind of flurry of bills around how do we address students with disabilities, their learning loss, the loss of their services and supports, and quite frankly, the adequate delivery of some of them. We found, especially with students with transition students, that any of the face-to-face community-based instruction, those type things that really don't work in a virtual environment, we're going to have an impact on their transition. So there was a lot of ideas, let's say, some that were focused on kids that have mental health or behavioral issues, all kinds of different little ideas that different legislators had. But then we finally came up with what was the beginnings of S3434.
Can we move to the next slide?
So
Go ahead, Peg.
no, you go right ahead, Deb.
So the legislation was introduced in February, and one of the things we look at initially with legislation is who introduced it. And in this case, it was introduced by very high-profile sponsors in the Senate. The Senate president was one of the prime sponsors, along with Senator Adiago. So we knew that this meant business. We immediately presented it to our special ed committee and developed our initial recommendations. Our committee, first and foremost, felt that the goals of the bill were important, and we agreed with them. There was a strong and immediate need to address the needs of this population of students, that they had lost time and services through no fault of their own. So we agreed with the purposes of the bill, but we did feel that it was very important to seek some amendments. And our goals initially were the first three bullets that are listed there. One was making sure that this was an IEP team decision, which included the parent, that any disputes would be resolved quickly, because we did not think we should be spending our time and money on litigation costs, but we should be trying to get kids into their service programs quickly. And lastly, that funding was critical and needed to be fully provided to districts so we could get this whole thing moving. Next slide. Moving to you, Peg, on terms of your
Right.
goal.
I want to piggyback a little bit too on what you said, Deb, because I think it's important for folks to understand that we're not always traditional partners, but a lot of times we are. And the goals that you put forth, the amendments that you were seeking, we worked with you and your committees. We worked with the majority office to try to get those amendments. We were in agreement with them. And like I said previously, and I'll probably say again before it's over, this isn't successful unless the people implementing it are successful. So we wanted the infrastructure to be there for schools. We wanted there to be an agreement and a process to make this happen. And it just works a whole lot easier if we're all on the same page and not in a constant dispute resolution type situation. So as Deb said, we have a framework around IEP team decision making. It made sense for it to be the vehicle for this legislation. So we were fully in agreement with that. And I'm going to be honest with you, we don't know exactly where the additional years of eligibility came from, but we certainly weren't going to oppose that. It wasn't something that was a focus of our eligibility because, as John said earlier, and as other situations arise, there's still a 2-year kind of window for compensatory education. So we weren't necessarily thinking about this entitlement for the next 3 years, but it makes sense in a lot of ways. We did advocate strongly on the funding mechanism because we thought it'd be a lot easier to implement this law with fidelity if we could make sure that there wasn't an impact on the local school districts' budgets to try to make that happen. We worked with our federal partners and 2 federal think tanks around school funding to mitigate the concerns about maintenance of effort and those type of considerations if you use state funding. But then, we're reassured that the federal funding in all 3 of those pieces of legislation will work to fund this. And then, of course, the legislation reflects that now. The flexibilities for the private schools, again, not something that was on the top of our advocacy list, but we certainly didn't oppose either. I think the one important thing that flexibility around private schools does bring to the forefront is what John said earlier, that there's some creativity around what this next year of resources for students could or should look like. So whether it's, waiving student numbers or official, capacity for the buildings that they have to live under, or if it's, and I guess we'll talk about it in a little bit, designing a response to the extension of transition services without just duplicating a senior year that was missing.
Let me see the next slide. So where we moved, as this process moved forward and those amendments were reached, bipartisan support grew. The bill originally started with 8 sponsors, and by the time it was passed, there were 37 bill sponsors who signed on to the bill. And what that tells you is that legislators realized that this was an important bill and they wanted their names on it. It passed unanimously in both houses, which is also a very unusual event. And then it moved to the governor for consideration. It was passed by final passage was June 3rd. You've heard he signed it on June 16th. So that period in between is another period of time where you have an opportunity to make a difference as an advocacy group. We engaged at that point. We were thinking now about implementation. Our goals at that point were a little bit different. We were now talking, having spoken with our special ed committee about certain issues. Number one, current year funding. Some districts were at a position, perhaps they were S2 districts who were actually facing cuts. Perhaps they were districts who had already struck budgets and had allocated their funding and now were facing some new costs they hadn't anticipated. So what we were asking for was current year funding for this first year of implementation, some mechanism to do that. We had proposed something like perhaps a special fund in the budget as one option, or some mechanism. Another thing we asked for was immediate guidance from the department and some kind of immediate funding application procedure if moving forward so that you could all get going on these programs. And lastly, what we wanted was clear and consistent messaging around this bill and what it provided for and what it did not provide for, because we wanted everyone to understand what it was, parents as well as districts, so we could move forward and frankly make your jobs easier as you tried to explain this to parents and stakeholders as you were trying to implement it. Peg, where were you at?
So, well, I love the first bullet, the sign the bill governor, but so like Deb said, the bill initially was introduced in the beginning of February, and we did pretty well for a while. There was bipartisan support, as Zip said, coming out of committees. We had good legislative leadership that were on board and sponsors of this bill. But then we, as with a lot of times when you're doing a legislative advocacy, the kind of rules and intricacies get difficult to understand if you're not doing this every day. So we had parents and families and students that were really excited about the legislation, saw it passing through committees, and then not understanding what the February till June issue was and why it took so long. So, first we did a lot of technical assistance and support for those families too, to understand that, yes, it passed through the Senate Education Committee, but now it has to go to an Appropriations Committee. And then we have to do it in the same thing. And what really kind of tripped folks up was after it passed the Assembly Appropriations Committee, they were like, yay, on to the governor. And I'm like, no, they added amendments and they were, there wasn't a problem with the amendments, except adding the amendments means we have to take the bill back to the Senate for a concurrent vote. So all of this just took so much time. And as the momentum was really gathering, we had town hall with the Council on Developmental Disabilities we had actually a lot of your members joined us and added to the conversation, as well as some adult service agencies. But all of this is going and rolling. And then on June 3rd, when the concurrent version was finally passed, it was like it grinded to a halt, especially as far as families were concerned. As they assumed, because of the support that Deb mentioned, because the whole, bipartisan support, both houses, full support, that when it got to the governor's desk, that it was like, okay, great. We've seen those bill signings. You take out the pen and you sign the bill. And then we kind of just hit a brick wall. So that is then where our advocacy was focused on, how important it was for the governor to sign the bill. What the impact on the students and families that were aging out at that point were, and what the impact on school districts were if all of a sudden those families all decided to file litigation, and that was the whole idea behind this bill to begin with, so that we didn't have that expensive, drawn out, and traumatic for families litigation process to have to deal with. So the timeliness issues as far as graduation, and telling families, oh, well, no, you can really refuse your diploma, and, write a letter, request, an IEP team, request, and, if that doesn't work, then request mediation or due process. But we really wanted to avoid that, but a lot of the time we weren't able to, because it took June 16th to sign the bill.
Yeah. Next slide. So finally, we got to the finish line. The governor did sign it, as John and everyone has mentioned. The governor, in his signing statement, announced $600 million from the American Rescue Plan was going to be set aside to fully fund this bill. He's talking about a separate pot of money than the ARP funds that have already been dedicated to education. So that money, the 2.7 billion dedicated to ed, is already committed to other purposes that's not being used for this. 8,700 students are estimated to be eligible, and as the governor indicated, he sees issues with maintenance of effort under IDEA as potentially problematic, and that's why he has chosen to set aside the ARP funds. The same day, the DOE issued some guidance. We're hoping for some more to assist you. And in fact, one of the things we'd like to ask all of you is that as you have questions on this, to either share them in the chat or to send them to me or Jenny Lamont in our government relations department, so that we can actually share them with the Department of Ed. Maybe we can ask them to do an FAQ document or some other guidance, so we can get that moving forward for not only our organization, but every organization that's working on this legislation. So what I'd like to do at this point is turn this over to Peg to talk about implementation and the parents' role moving forward.
I think we need the next slide. Okay, so again, I'll piggyback on our partner there. As far as the need for, we appreciate the immediate guidance, but we do think there are some process or implementation help that we can get. We had a conversation very recently about, the discussion to think outside the box in implementing this, each supports and services. So there's, for a lot of families, there's no need to, replicate the physical education class that was missed, or some of the other quote unquote requirements, which would be typical of a senior year, but are not what their focus or worries are. So thinking outside the box is maybe focusing on that face-to-face, that community-based instruction, that hands-on implementation, the really significant connections to other adult service agencies, which was also lost. All those things to really just prepare a student to successfully transition is what's most important. So how do we let that happen in the IEP process? Typically your IEPs had certain requirements. So I think we wanted some additional framing from the Department of Ed around those issues, because we don't think that just duplicative services, or let's just repeat that whole last year, is what a lot of families are looking for. And it's not what the law says that, and again, not a lawyer, but it doesn't really require that. So we want to look for ways to really successfully transition students, give them that support. It's such a trying time for families when they're losing their educational entitlement and not quite sure what to expect on the other side of the fence. And then without that type of kind of warm handoff or dipping your toe into those other services and you know, looking for, I mean, parents of students with disabilities, just like every other parent, you know, wants their students to have, you know, independent living opportunities, competitive integrated employment, social opportunities, all those pieces that with the isolation and lack of one-on-one services and the ability that even what you learned virtually or in the classroom, you can generalize into the community, we're all lost. And you know, I know I'm telling, you know, I'm preaching to the choir with this group, but there's a reason that the numbers are even worse this past year for employment opportunities or successful transition for students with disabilities. They weren't anything to cheer about to begin with, but this, you know, this lack of service or adequate services, let's say, for the year has been, you know, hugely impactful. But I also don't necessarily think I need to take a science class again if that's not where my focus is. If I need language arts, you know, great. I can take, you know, if I'm having communication issues, I need some more support in language arts for employment opportunities, that's great. But then we have to look at too what where this coordination and again learning, we're all, you know, doing this kind of building the plane as we fly it, the integration with adult service agencies and not being duplicative of those services, but also not delaying some of the access to those services for families. So, I mean, the bottom line is it's been trying. All of the same experiences that students with out disabilities had, students and families with disabilities had, whether it was learning loss, the social emotional implications, the isolation, the you know, therapies we know for a lot of kids did not work well in a virtual environment. So there's a lot of issues there to kind of peel back, but I think that's what makes the thinking out of the box so important, the creativity around developing a learning plan and transition plan that can meet the students' needs, but you're also successful in implementing on your end. So we would, you know, we basically tell families, write a letter, request the IEP meeting, have the conversation. We had a lot of talk recently about, you know, being able to participate in a graduation ceremony, even if you don't take the diploma because of Alicia's law. And also to be creative in their thinking as well, and to be open to communication and conversation with the district around planning that. And, you know, I would say the same thing to you as districts. Come in with an open mind. Don't start with a no or we don't have to. Because if you start this conversation off on both sides in an adversarial, you're going to end up in a due process hearing or mediation, which is what we were really trying to alleviate from the beginning. So if we can work together, you know, at the policy level, we're hoping that on the ground level, at the district level, that families and district staff and personnel can work together to meet the students' needs, but not be such a deficit or impact on your district's operations as it is.
I agree, and I want to thank you, Peg, for joining me, and pass this on to Peggy McDonald. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.
Good morning, everyone. So now to piggyback on what Peg and Deb were talking about, the money is committed. The governor has committed the funds to pay for these services. The law is in place. So now really is a time where we can transition to focusing on how this can be done in the best interest of our students. So these are just some strategies to think about. One is that this is a 3-year commitment, so that you can really start thinking about a 3-year plan. How is this going to be done? How are you going to talk to your parents? How are you going to train your child study teams on how to broach this in the coming IEP meetings and plan, again, in the best interest of the kids during their final year next year and then for the additional services? When are you going to start IEP meetings for this? How will you document the services provided, and how will you document the students' performance so that, again, transitioning into employment, they have that kind of resume of information about any job sampling or work experiences or other types of experiences in the community they will be afforded through this bill. Looking at the budget, talking to your BA. We don't have information on how this money is coming or how districts will get it, but that will be forthcoming. So having those discussions with your BA and getting that information into your plan will be key as well. Convening an implementation team, identifying some staff, your high school child study team, your high school supervisor, some parent representatives, and again, bringing in early, as everyone has said, bring in DVR, DDD as soon as possible. If you not already have discussed with them how this is going to affect the transition to DDD services in those cases, how some of these services could actually complement DDD. They can't duplicate, but can they complement? Those kinds of questions can begin to be discussed so that for not only this cohort, but the next 2 cohorts of kids, you will have some good services in place for them. Using your CPAG, your parent group, for communication with parents and families. Think about how that's going to be done over the next 2 years, in addition to the immediate conversations. Think about how having the DDD or DVR liaisons at IEP meetings. This has always been an issue. It's not always possible, but again, maybe in these cases, since these kids are so close to transition, that it might be something that could be more possible. And it's also another opportunity to expand your use of person-centered planning. We have a resource page that is in the folder that you're going to be given through the chat. And that has some information about how to access the resources on the state's person-centered planning process. And that also links to national resources. Those may be helpful, again, in engaging the student in making these decisions. Again, as Peg said, and you'll hear in a minute, work sites were impacted by COVID, so students didn't get those job sampling opportunities. But now there are also many employers who are looking for, for staff, so that there might be new job sampling and community work placements available to you. Getting that person-centered planning process in place will help identify those that would be best matched to the student. And also identify and sharing resources for planning among your county groups, with each other, and through our special education committee. If you have any suggestions, put them in the chat. We're talking about how maybe getting together during the summer so that directors can share strategies that they are using. And with that, I'm going to introduce a video that we did with the Ridgefield School District. So now we're going to hear straight from the field. And Ridgefield's a district that has a history of with transition. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Rob to start our video, and you'll hear again some of the ways in which this particular district has started working on this already. Rob? Good morning. I'm pleased this morning to bring to you 2 representatives of the Ridgefield Public Schools to talk about how they are implementing S3434. We are pleased to bring them to you because they have a long history with very effective transition services, so they are well poised to address the variations in how this bill will be implemented in meeting the individual needs of students. So Pat, would you like to begin by introducing yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Pat Drummond, Supervisor of Special Services in the Ridgefield School District, and this is Dr. Lori Denson, our Supervisor of the High School Program, which oversees most of our transition services for the district.
Thank you so much again for joining us. So let's begin with a few questions. So what planning has been done so far in the district to provide services as a result of the implementation of S3434?
Well, we've met as a team, and when we had inklings that this was coming into being, we met to see what we would possibly have to do. So we made a list of potential students who would benefit the most, who would possibly need the most services, because we service students from severe to, in-class support students. So we reviewed the list. Being that we're a receiving district, we did speak to out-of-district case managers and districts to let them know that these are potential students that might be on the available list. My own team met with parents to discuss the possibility that if this bill passed, that they could be offered these services. Then we looked at what impact it would have on us. We would need additional related services. The spaces, because we do have, a shortage of space in the building, right?
Yep.
What additional staff? We would need more counselors and
Job coaches,
teachers. And then being that we run an ESY program and it would start then, we had to see, where we had to staff the ESY program because not all of our teachers work 12 months. So it started when we first heard of it, and we looked at, we also looked at which students would really benefit the most from this services if we were limited to how many we could do.
And you mentioned that briefly about your interaction with families. How did you engage families in discussing this even before the law was passed?
Well, my own district resident students, our team was instructed to bring it up at the IEP meetings. We didn't have a large population at that time, that age. So it was discussed, but most of our parents decided to move on to graduation. But the idea was, placed and discussed with the parents at the IEP meetings.
And for our out-of-district, the out-of-district students, if a parent brought it up to us and asked about it, we said it's an option, but you have to discuss that with your team so that we could have a meeting.
Okay, and going forward, we have 2 more cohorts now, kids who will be turning 21 in the next 2 years who'd be eligible for these services. How will you engage parents going forward?
I think now that we know it's out there and it's something that they're eligible to receive, we will be discussing it in the beginning of the year when the IEP meetings start. And actually, we've even thought of doing a presentation to parents of that age level students.
Right, excellent, thank you. So with the many paths students have been on post graduation before this law, what are some examples of the services that the IEP teams are planning for this year's graduates as part of this these services?
We're planning on continuing what they've been doing in terms of what this last year should have looked like if we weren't on shutdown. So they would still be going out to job sites 3 to 5 days a week, depending on their age and what jobs they were going to. The transition classes where they're learning their soft skills. So everything we were kind of keeping in place, but targeting, okay, they're going to be aging out at some point, again, focusing on what they're going to need to move forward with their lives.
A lot of the students that didn't benefit from virtual,
Right.
We did a lot of soft skills, but they really need on-job site training and
hands-on.
So we're looking to see where they were going to go if they were going to DDD. And we're finding out there's a shortage of staff at DDD, so a lot of the students were being recommended for home programming.
Right.
So those are the students we really want to see back in school, because we don't feel that a home program is the most beneficial for them.
Okay, excellent. And the governor's committed up to $600 million for this effort. In addition to teachers, paraprofessionals, some of the things that you mentioned, what additional costs do you anticipate will be incurred as a result of this law?
Well, I think besides, we will definitely need more job coaches. We do send more assistants. We send assistants out on our job sites. We send a nurse out
every day.
So we've actually run into difficulty obtaining these services. So we'll be looking for that. We'll need more space. We're in the process of building new trailers. I know, trailers for our students, modulars, and they're being put up this summer. So hopefully we'll obtain some space if we have to address additional students. So it's really bus drivers, buses, all those things that are, that impact on them getting to the job sites and back. So it'll be drivers and buses and expansions and assistants and nurses.
What about related services? Do you anticipate some of these students receiving related services?
Well, yes.
Yeah, I think in looking at the numbers, I think we've built in enough. We have enough space in our current schedules that I think we're okay for now. But it's possible we might need, like, if we get any more students, then additional students, then we might have to add. But right now, I think we're able to hold it. We're okay with that.
We've been
Just
trying,
the job coaches and assistants are the big ones.
And we've been trying to do, if possible, give them additional services for speech that they might have missed during the pandemic and the close. But we are, in all honesty, having difficulty obtaining related service staff.
But I will say, we've been pretty fortunate that even during the shutdown, the kids have been receiving their services. So their related services really did not stop unless we had the services available, virtual or in person, whatever, wherever we were in the model at that point. So I don't feel like we need to give compensatory because they missed things in the past. So it's more of, what was in their IEP last year, and we can maintain it for the following year. We were pretty fortunate in that way.
Great. We talked a little bit about informing families and discussing this at IEP meetings going forward for the kids who are going to be turning 21 in the next 2 years. But what additional long-term planning do you anticipate will be necessary for those students in terms of programming?
Well, go ahead.
We want to talk about, the kids who haven't received their possibility of an extra year. So obviously we'll start, like Pat was saying, start in the fall to start talking at IEP meetings about what could come next, and then really push forward with the DDD and the formerly over 21 programs, and talking about, where are you on that path? Because a lot of parents sat back and didn't really finish those, the paperwork and all that because of the pandemic, or it was just overwhelming. So it's really going to be a push this year to have the parents come in, have them work with one of our staff members to get the paperwork in place so that when they age out at 22, whatever it is, they're ready to go. Because that's another piece for us, is that the kids who are, supposed to be in day programs really weren't able, they don't have a placement. So we want to make sure that next year they're ready to go, and we, help them along the path to get there.
And we want to try and increase our job sites, because a lot of our placements were nursing homes, hospitals, so those are sites some parents are reticent to send their students to, and then some of them are reticent to take us back. Right. So with the increased students, we're going to have to increase our job potential sites.
And so you're talking to your colleagues from around the state in this session. What are some of the important challenges and considerations for your child study teams and for your general district leaders in implementing these services over the next couple of years?
I think that where our goal will be to work as a team with the out-of-district placements, with probably with related, supplementing our related services, because we do have a big related service staff, but our needs sometimes go beyond what we have. Working together with the parents to make sure they stay informed. And I think working together regionally, just to stay sure we stay informed, because this kind of came up on us pretty quickly.
Right. And I think that there have been, working, I have a lot of out-of-district teams, and a lot are interpreting the law and what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do differently. So for us, it's more like, okay, where are we? This is, they're asking me, well, what are other districts doing? So it's kind of being the informant and all of us coming to a consensus as to how this law is being implemented. What does it look like? If a parent says, well, next for the compensatory ed, I want my child's program to be only this. Well, how do you navigate that when, you also have a program to run that's, so it's kind of working together to make parents understand what we have, how can we work together to make it right for the student.
And make sure each student has a post-secondary goal, and that's what we try to achieve for them.
Okay, excellent. So just finally, any words of wisdom, any comments for your colleagues as part of the session that you would like to share on this topic?
For me, I would say, be flexible. It's hard. It's very hard because you feel like you're in a time crunch. But the parents who have asked for the most part, and the parents who are just finding out they just don't know what's right. Your parents we have one student who's set up for a day program in September, but then they said, well, do we keep him back? So it's really a conversation and looking at each individual student as to see what's appropriate. Is it the transitional skills that they need? Is that why they need an extra year? Is it the social emotional needs? Where are we and what do we think that they can benefit? And can we give them what they need, in an extra year?
And we're all in a learning pattern here. So just working together, I keep saying working together as a team with the state, with our fellow district managers, case managers, just working together and knowing that we're all in the same boat.
All right, thank you. That's great words to end on. And it also sounds like collaboration with your representatives from the other state agencies, DDD, DVR, seems to be coming through as a strategy as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. And again, we hope to continue this conversation and we look forward to hearing from you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Nice.
Hey, Dave. Dave is going to lead us in some final questions and answers. Dave Nash.
Thanks so much, Peg, and for that great interview as well. So one question I wanted to raise, how do we allay the fears perhaps that we may have from district personnel that establishing these compensatory services because of the pandemic could be precedent setting for other situations? And it would be interesting to comment on that and the importance of being precise and tying what we're doing to what has occurred because of the pandemic. So perhaps John Worthington, maybe if you wanted to comment first on this issue.
Sure, thank you, David. Yeah, I think as far as precedent, excuse me, precedent setting, I don't think that is big of a concern. You're looking at a specific law that's basically extending eligibility for certain students for a year for additional or compensatory services. It's unique to that law, and so providing them, delineating exactly what you're providing in accordance with the law, I don't know that it's going to necessarily impact any other compensatory ed cases. In fact, for these students, I think it should, I can't say eliminate, but probably reduce the chances that anyone that aged out this year or the next 2 years will necessarily be seeking additional compensatory services, because it's basically being addressed through this law. And so I don't see it as creating a need or any kind of precedent for others receiving services. Certainly, there's going to be claims for compensatory services for students of different ages. Here, we're really limiting it to the 18 to 21-year-olds, which are mostly receiving transition, not exclusively, mostly transition. So I don't think it translates to the students that might be seeking more in the academic context compensatory when they're in the age 3 through 18 category. I don't see it creating any kind of extra requirement for compensatory beyond the claims that you're probably going to get because there was a pandemic and things were different.
Dave, could I just add on that one? I think it also calls for the importance of documenting what you're doing and documenting any outcomes, not only to determine whether or not the student achieved his or her post-school goals, but is ready to achieve those goals, and also then not be in the position where even after 22 there's a feeling that the student did not get appropriate services. So documenting what you're giving and having measures to determine how well the student did, whatever evaluations you use for job performance, progress on community living skills, progress on communication skills in the community, using all those measures to really have that student exit with a clear picture of what he or she accomplished and is ready to do.
Peg Kinzel, I'm wondering if you could comment on the importance of parents communicating perhaps some of the challenges that their children may have experienced related to social and emotional learning and isolation, and making sure that we consider those as we're addressing compensatory services.
Well, that is a great segue, just the documentation piece itself, because we, of course, told families that documentation is critical, and whether it was amount of services, length of services, you know, those things that were consistent with the IEP, but then really drilling down for impact. You know, what was the impact of virtual services? What is the impact of the social isolation that a lot of these students unfortunately still have all their social interactivity the same as their educational interactivity. And so when that was all stripped away, the impact was considerable for a lot of families. So trying to explain one of the best things we, which is terrible to say best, but one of the most impactful things at the beginning of when COVID started was talking to a parent that had, her son was just out of sorts because he didn't know why he wasn't getting on the school bus. He didn't know why he wasn't seeing his friends. And so finally she took him over to the school and showed him that nobody else was there. The principal came out and talked to him, said, you know, me and Mr. Jones are here to help keep the building clean and safe, but none of your students, none of your friends. He, in his head, imagined school was going on, everybody was, you know, carrying on, and he was just being left out of it. So it's those kind of things that we didn't really think about because, you know, parents, just like school folks, you know, it came on really quick. We weren't prepared. We had, you know, the technology issues, the isolation issue, and trauma, quite frankly, because a lot of families, as well as education staff, had the additional trauma of families affected by COVID. So being able to explain to school districts, and they understand it, sometimes you just have to kind of, you know, think in that framework from a family's point of view and what the conditions were. Not every family has the resources or the capability to make situations even conducive to learning. So, and quite frankly, kids that were getting significant behavioral supports or social emotional supports that had regressive behavior and ended up in crisis situations was, you know, a whole nother, you know, whole other factual sheet to address. So it's really, that's why I'm here. On vacation, I'm here talking to you guys because I think the communication and the partnership between your membership and our families is crucial to this success for students.
And one final question, Deb, for you. We are in an age where perhaps there can be some cynicism about the impact that we can have on the political process. Do you want to talk about some of the lessons that we can take from this experience and how much of an impact we can have when we work together to advocate?
Well, I think advocacy is advocacy with capital A is not a bad word. I think sometimes we forget, now I'm going to sound ridiculous, but the legislation this year about the impact of teaching kids again how government works, how the community works, a civics education is important. It's critically important for every student. It's especially important for students with disabilities. So we try to engage them as well with this advocacy, so they're contributing members and committed, you know, members of their communities. But I can't say enough. The advocacy, the impact. When we held those town halls, we had a couple hundred families that were tuning in, asking questions. How do I engage? I told you we kind of had to do a civics 101 around some of the legislation and how a bill becomes a law. Because it was so frustrating for families. And, you know, having the virtual committee hearings, they're really good in some ways, but really not so good, because those kind of conversations you need to have. with legislators, with other sponsors of the bill, and with, partners like you guys are, were to us, happens a lot. It just happens a lot better when it's in the halls of the State House. And the impact of families is felt even stronger, and students especially, when they become active members in it. So we work hard on it. I go out and do training and, opportunities for families to engage in different kind of advocacy, but I think it's critical, and it's certainly critical to any kind of disability rights movement. That's all that ever really moved that wheel forward.
Deb Bradley, any final comments?
From our end, I think advocacy is a bridge. I always look at it that way, that we're bridging worlds. Legislators went to school a long time ago and they think they know how schools work, but you are the professional educators who actually make the schools work today. I'm one voice representing your voice, but you need to be involved in the decision making about bills and talking about the impact of legislation that's proposed on the real world of schools so that we can bring it back to them. So in terms of making a difference, I can tell you that PSA is at the education table all the time. We always try to be constructive. We always come with concrete recommendations that, in our view, we think make a bill better. And we're often successful in that. They may look like small changes, but they really may change the way you actually get to implement a bill. So my final voice is for you to get involved. Our remote committee hearings have actually increased member participation because you don't have to leave your buildings. But please join us, because talking about these bills is critical. They never stop coming, and the thousands of bills that get introduced each session can actually impact your work on a significant level. Just yesterday, the budget was passed. So $100 million was increased in the pot of extraordinary special ed aid as an increase this year. And in terms of the funding of this particular bill, we don't know exactly how the DOE is going to implement it. When we do know that, we'll let you know. Our advocacy doesn't stop when a bill becomes law. We then go to the implementation stage with the department as well. So thanks for all you do, and that's my final word.
So thank you again to all of our incredible panelists, and for all of you in the field for the wonderful work that you're doing every day in the most trying of circumstances. We certainly appreciate all of the great work and your commitment to our children.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I want to thank the PSA and FEA team, as well as Peg Kinsel from SPAN and our colleagues over at Ridgefield. As I mentioned earlier, I really encourage you to get involved in the committee work at NJPSA. It's only through collaboration and involvement and professional learning that we can work together to do what's best for our kids. By Monday at the latest, you'll receive an email with the recording and the resource folder link. But in the meantime, and as always, feel free to reach out to us for anything we can do to support you in the work you're doing in our schools. Take care. Have a great rest of the summer. Thank you for all that you do.